And maybe while we wait on another person or two, why don't we go ahead and get our web GUI started up. I'm just going to share my screen. So I know it's been a couple weeks for us meeting. So let's go ahead and just run this again. And basically what we'll do is we'll run this, then while we're running it in the background, we'll talk a little bit, and then we'll hopefully have it set up once it's ready to go. So again, for this notebook, you just go ahead and connect to Drive first things first. And then because it's been a couple weeks, I know there's been a lot of updates to this repo. So definitely make sure you check the update repo button. You're going to have a lot of different code updates you're going to want to download. I don't think we'll look at any of them this week, but I think in the next week or two, we might look at some of the updates. And then let's just queue up all these other items. So we'll go ahead and click the play button next to the model, download and load. Again, we've already downloaded our model, so I don't think we need to do anything with that. And then we'll scroll down here and we'll hit installing requirements and hit play there. And then we'll finally hit start stable diffusion and hit play. I find this usually takes a couple of minutes to get up and running. So I think while we wait on that, let's just go ahead and dive into class. So first off, thanks everybody again for being flexible with last week's schedule. I know I was out. I hope people got to watch the videos that I posted. If you didn't, that's okay. I won't be covering all the material from those videos, but I will sort of highlight where they might be helpful. And we might look at a little bit of detail from those today, but I would definitely recommend that if you didn't watch them yet, that you watch them this week, because I think there's a lot of helpful material in there. All right. The other nice thing is because we skipped last week, I'm now completely synced up with my ITP class and this class. So I already taught this today. So I feel like I am ready to go, and I've streamlined a little bit. So there are the slides for anyone interested. So again, this week we're going to really be diving into text prompts. We'll be looking at all sorts of ways to sort of tweak our text prompts. We'll look at some tools that might help build better text prompts for us, all that sort of stuff. Next week, we'll dive into image and video, and then the week after we'll do training. So I would say after this week, you might want to start to think a little bit about hey, is there a project I want to work on? Is there anything that I'm interested in sort of experimenting more with? I'm fully aware that next week and the week after, there'll be some new stuff. So you might even want to change your topic. But again, I would say start to think about ideas for a small little project that maybe takes 2 or 3 weeks. Also as a reminder, office hours are on Thursdays from 7:30 to 8:30 p.m. EST. Again, I'll just post a note in our Slack channel and see if people want to join. If these times don't work for you, just DM me. You can always set up other time. All right, so here's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to do a quick lecture just on how clip works. We talked a lot about how the generator side of things work. So I want to talk a little bit how clip works as well. The majority of our day is just going to be spent in the web GUI. So we're going to play with some text prompts. We're going to try different things. We're going to look at some of the scripting options that are available inside of the web GUI format. And then I think we'll spend a little bit of time looking at this thing called Prompt Matrix, which is a pretty cool tool built inside of the web GUI that allows us to do a lot of exploration of different text prompts. And that'll help sort of expedite some of our experiments for the week. And then lastly, I think now that we're getting into prompts, I think it's a good time for us to talk about the ethical considerations of these models. So I'll spend a little bit of time, and maybe we can have a little chat after we're at the end of class just about how we can approach these things ethically, or how we can think about them in sort of an ethics framework. All right, so last week, or I guess 2 weeks ago now, we looked at how to generate images using image generators, right? So we know there's Stable Diffusion, there's VQGAN, there's Aphantasia, there's all these models that can generate images for us. And we've sort of glossed over yeah, they all attach to clip. So this week, we're going to talk a little bit about how clip works. And that I think that'll help explain a little bit about why this is the right tool for us to be using for this particular this whole system. But I think it's still important to remember that there are many different clip models. There are the ones OpenAI built, and then there are also the ones that are now open source. It's called OpenClip. So just like the image generators, There are also a bunch of different text prompt models, and we probably won't look at most of them today because actually I think Stable Diffusion actually has its own built-in sort of clip scoring system that I think really works off the open clip. I think it works on the same data set that the image generator is built on. So we'll talk about that. We'll look at some tools on how to explore that data set. But I just want to talk a little bit about how this whole system works, so you understand how it differs from like maybe a more common sort of classifier system. So clip is not is very different from what we would call a traditional classifier. So traditional classifier is probably like, you know, as of like 5 or 6 years ago, this is what machine learning really was. It was, you can upload a photo and it says whether there's a hot dog in the photo or not, right? So a traditional classifier is actually like really a manual data set. So some poor research intern at a lab is sort of told like, hey, I need you to go find me 500 images of each one of these classes. And by class, I mean a different like label or a different type of image. So they would say, we want to make a model that figures out 100 different types of animals. So go find us images of dogs, images of cats, images of turtles, images of birds, images of snakes, and basically like create folders for each one of these. So create a folder of dogs, a folder of cats, a folder of turtles. And what we're going to do is we're going to label each one of those. So we'll create a little text document and we'll say, here are all the file names, and those correspond to this class or this label. And this was how a classifier was made. And today, I think actually like the fast AI stuff is kind of a good note. Today, like your very first example in the fast AI class is make your own classifier. And with all of their tools and their libraries set up, it takes you about 30 minutes to make your own classifier. So we've really like moved to a place where building a classifier is actually a very simple problem now. But 6, 8 years ago, it was like the cutting edge of machine learning. Now, one of the things that's really good about these classifier systems is what they end up doing is they end up being able to tell you exactly what's in a photo. So I upload a photo of my cat and it's going to say that's a cat. I know with a certain level of accuracy or probability, like I'm 90% sure that that photo is of a cat. The downside is, let's say I'm in the middle of making this classifier and my boss now changes his mind and says, actually, instead of just dogs or cats, we want to know, are these puppies or are they adult dogs? Or are they kittens or are they adult cats? And in that case, building a classifier means I actually have to go back and create a new data set, right? I can't just use the data set I have, or I might be able to like go into the dog folder and pull out, you know, okay, this is a puppy, this is a puppy, and I'm gonna have to relabel all that data. So the challenge here is that with this sort of traditional classifier system, it's very strict. It says, here, I know what a dog is, and I know what a cat is. And I can't then tell that classifier to also tell me, well, like, is this a Persian cat? Is it a tabby cat? Is it a Siamese cat? Right, like this model doesn't know that. It's not been labeled that. It doesn't know how to work with that. And this is kind of the challenge that people kept running into with these classifiers. It's like, well, if I want to do this, I have to relabel all my data and I've got to relearn how to classify things. So over the past couple of years, people have been trying to figure out like, well, wait, how do we make a classifier that sort of learns on its own? This is what we call a supervised machine learning model. So if you hear unsupervised or supervised, supervised means I've already told the model that like, here's all the classes you need to know about. Unsupervised is kind of the opposite. It says, here's the data, go figure out what the classes are. So that's where Clip sort of comes in. Now, there's been a lot of other models before Clip that did this, but Clip has kind of become like the de facto one. And we'll talk a little bit about why. Clip stands for Contrastive Language Image Pre-training. The language image is probably pretty clear, right? These are language-image data sets, right? So it comes with both an image and a caption for that image. The contrastive is what we're going to talk about in just a minute. Contrastive is how this thing learns. It uses contrast to actually be able to figure out what classes or what labels it should apply to these images. And the real key here is like, I think with Clip coming out, it really showed that like one of the challenges we have with classifiers is not, you know, just the unsupervised part, but also how do we get enough data for an unsupervised model? So in a prior world, you could get away with like 100 images of dogs, 100 images of cats, and 100 images of turtles. And the model would get pretty accurate results because it could figure out sort of what the differences are between these images and sort of work off that. Here, the challenge is we're saying like, hey, you don't have the classes and you don't have the label data. I need you to go make that up. And what it turns out is like you need a ton of data to actually make that happen. So OpenAI basically built this data set where they scraped most of the internet as much as they could find, millions upon millions of images. And they were able to build a sort of unsupervised, quote unquote, classless classifier because of this. So the process for this is actually like somewhat similar, but also like quite different. So remember that previously with a classifier, you had like basically folders of images, they were labeled, and the model could then could guess, is this image a cat or is it a dog? And would sort of learn because the labels are already provided. In this case, we're not really like classifying folders of images or sets of images. All we have are the individual pairs of an image and a piece of text. So imagine there's millions and millions of images where they've got an image and a text pair that go together. What contrastive learning says is it says, hey, let me take like maybe 100 of the images in that million and compare them to each other. So what you're seeing here is it's going to take out the labels, the text captions, and it's going to run that through a text encoder. And really all that encoder does, it tries to place those into a space. So we haven't really covered latent spaces in this class. I know I have previously, but imagine that we're trying to position each of these in a space where maybe all the descriptions of cats are kind of localized toward each other. And all the like dogs or other materials are localized in other clusters. So we're going to place all these in a text encoder, and we're going to then like say like, okay, here are the text labels. Then we're going to take all the images, and the images are going to go through an encoder. This is sort of like a traditional, machine learning, like look at all the edges, look at all the shapes, that sort of thing. And those are going to be placed in an image encoder. Then what the contrastive part tries to do is it tries to compare each label to each image and tries to guess how closely they are to each other, right? Like this is basically like, okay, I'm guessing that, when it starts guessing, because when these things start, they're pretty dumb. It's going to maybe almost randomly guess which ones go to which caption goes to what image. Over time, what ends up happening is the model learns that this caption goes with this image, and this caption goes with this image. And what ends up happening over time is that because we've got millions and millions of images that it's sort of cycling through and relearning, that it kind of learns that like, oh, anything that says tabby cat should be with an image that kind of looks like this. Or anything that says turtle should look like an image it has that associates with this. So we end up getting are these clusters of labels and a cluster of sort of concepts that match images. We didn't say, hey, all of like images 1 through 1000 are of cats. The model kind of learns that itself by seeing labels that are sort of similar, use similar language, and images that look similar. And we end up as like, there's no classes in this model, but we end up with a very flexible system of labels and a very flexible system of scoring, right? These are all probability scores. There's no scoring here that is just like, it is either A or B. It sort of says, based on what I know and based on the images you're showing me, I can say that this image is highly likely to include a cat or should have a label of a cat, or this image should very likely have tabby cat, or this label should very much have cute puppy, right? Because I've seen a lot of images of cute puppies because it's the internet, versus this image is very likely to be an old dog laying on a porch. Hopefully there's a lot of images of porches and a lot of images of dogs, and we can start to learn how those two go together. This is what's really powerful about CLIP, is because there's no predefined classes, it can begin to associate in a much more flexible way. And obviously then when we want to apply this to an image generator, that flexibility is really powerful, because now we can give it phrases that maybe the model has never seen, and it can sort of begin to learn like, oh, okay, you want a porch and then you want an alien. I've never seen a photo of an alien on a porch, but I know what all these concepts are and I can kind of figure out how to combine them. And that's why CLIP is a much more powerful tool for this kind of use than, say, a traditional classifier. And again, just to reiterate, the important part of what CLIP was able to do is it was able to say, like, just give me all the data that's out there, like a very data hungry models. Whereas other classifiers, because they were kind of human made, or were very clearly defined categories, we're able to say like, okay, like I need a folder of dogs and let's do 250 images, or a folder of horses and let's do 1,000 images. right? So again, this like large, data structure is actually what powers this tool. And that also introduces things like bias, some of the other things we're going to talk about with ethical considerations, because OpenAI didn't care where they scraped the data from. If you have an artist with a fairly well-known website and it was scrapable via Google, like if Google could find it, they went ahead and scraped it. So we'll come back to this and talk about like, what's the ethics of scraping people's data without them knowing, and how does that end up happening that now gets built in the model. So now a model can say like, oh, give me images from an artist who probably doesn't want their work in this. And before I move on, I want to mention that that this all sounds like Clip is great. Why aren't we doing this for all of our models? And did I mention? Oh, here we go. So there's a machine learning paper for Clip. So if you want to read more about Clip and understand how it works, the link is here, and you're welcome to read it. I've talked about this before about reading papers. Very few people in the world can read a paper front to beginning to end and be like, I know exactly what this said. I do not know. I cannot do that. I definitely cannot read the math in a paper. But what I usually recommend is look at the charts, look at the graphs, read through it, and try to highlight the parts that actually like are human readable, or like us average human readable. And you'll find there's some interesting things in here. For instance, there is a chart in here, and this chart compares Clip to other popular machine learning data set models that have been trained on particular models. So you'll see here, these are the names of data sets. So Stanford cars, you could literally Google this. And if you Google it, something like, I think there's something like 200 categories of cars with something like 20,000 images. So again, there's a data set of images of cars, and they're all labeled by maybe make and model and type or year. So this graph is saying that compared to Stanford cars, which is been its own trained model, Clip apparently does much, much better of a job. I'm sure because the internet is full of thousands upon thousands of car images, and with makes and models in the descriptions. So therefore, the hope is that Clip is better at that than like, say, a traditional classifier system. But that's not always true. As we go down this set of data sets, we'll see bird snap, which I assume is like a bird classifying system. So all of a sudden, it doesn't do as well as birds. It doesn't do as well at flowers. So I use a lot of flowers in my work. Maybe Clip is not really the best suited choice for that. All the way down to Eurosat, which I believe is satellite imagery. So in many cases, Clip is good or better than what else is out there, but it's not always true that this is possible. So if you read through the paper, they will explicitly say like, hey, it turns out this isn't as good for X, Y, and Z. So if that happens to be like, maybe you want to generate images using that, it might be worthwhile to think like, oh, maybe I need to like go in and train my own model to actually cover some of that. I would say maybe this is a data problem, right? Maybe they haven't scraped enough flowers, or it might actually be that the huge data set is actually a problem. And we're finding is that the model is compressing the flower space into too small of an area to try to fit everything else in. I'm sure there's lots of more work going on around like how they can make these models better for these sort of use cases. But I think it's important to say like, Clip is not one size fits all. It's not going to solve every problem out there. But in a lot of cases, and especially with what we do, it is the best option for what we have. Okay, any questions about that? All right. Let's see if our web GUI is up and running. So you'll notice a bunch of stuff changed here. It looks like they're now localizing the tool, which is pretty cool. But there's a lot of API and model changes. So it's good if you see a lot of this. And sure enough, I am running now on a tunneled URL. So again, remember that your URL is going to be different than mine, but you can grab it from the Colab notebook here. And we just need to go ahead and say click to continue. All right, so we're up and running. So what I'm going to do now is I just want to talk through sort of like some things that I've learned about text prompts, some things other people have learned, and sort of like maybe best case or like just some good options to start with. One of the challenges with text prompts is you might find a particular result works for you in your particular text prompt. And if you try to like generalize that structure, and apply it to the next text prompt, it might not work as well. So I'll just sort of give you some guidelines on things that I've seen that work well, things other people have seen works well. But no, it's not a one size fits all. And part of the fun and or pain of text to image processing is basically constantly rewriting these text prompts to try and see if you can optimize for a certain control. The other thing I should mention is if you were to Google today, text prompt guide or guide to writing the best prompts, you very likely will end up on a page that was written 6 months ago. And the challenge with that is that that was written for either VQGAN or Disco Diffusion. And every one of these models has a slightly different use case for how what text prompts work and what text prompts don't. So a guide to text prompts that is 6 months old will not actually really work for Stable Diffusion. And actually have not really seen a lot of really well documented Stable Diffusion text prompts or text prompt guides yet. But I will say a lot of what you'll see in those prompt guides will generally apply to Stable Diffusion, but they're not a perfect one-to-one. So you might have tried a text prompt in VQGAN that worked really, really well. And it was like a particular artist or maybe a particular conceptual phrase. When you apply that to Stable Diffusion, it might not work as well. And that might be a data problem, might be another problem with how the model is built. Kind of a challenge. This is kind of the frustrating thing about a lot of these things is that as people move on to different models, some things slightly change. So actually, you know, a lot of people that are still working in VQGAN or still working in Disco Diffusion because it's their process, it's their workflow, they know how it works, and they've yet to move up to Stable Diffusion, or maybe they just don't like Stable Diffusion. So just one thing to be aware of, I think a lot of the guidelines that I'll give you will generally apply to all these models. But for the most part, we're going to focus on Stable today, and that's what we're going to work through. Okay. So again, as I mentioned, data sets really matter. Each one of these models has their own generator that has been trained on image and text pairs. They all have their own clip scoring method. You know, some of them don't even use clip, they use some internal system. So if you watch the videos from last week, you know that haveibeentrained.com is a really helpful thing to look at. So really quickly, I won't go through all of this because it is included in that video. But if you go to haveibeentrained.com, this is literally the data set that Stable Diffusion was trained on. So because it's an open source model, the data is also open source. Those two are not mutually compatible, but because of how Stable Diffusion was built, they built on an open source data set and they released the open source model. So we can actually look at all 5.8 billion images that were included in that data set. Now, one thing I should note, I mentioned this in the video, is not all 5.8 billion images were actually included in Stable Diffusion. They had this other scoring thing that like, you know, had a bunch of other stuff in it that called this down. I don't know what the actual number ended up being, but it's definitely not all 6 billion. So a really nice thing about this tool is, let's say that I'm like really interested in, I don't know, let's pick a topic. I really want to know about, okay, so here's a graphic designer that I'm very familiar with. I really want to see if I can generate images like that graphic designer. So the graphic designer's name is Eric Niche. And so I've typed in this name, and what I get out are a lot of images of people that are not him. And what's interesting here is I do get some of his work. These are some of his images. These are not his images. This is also not his image. I'm very familiar with this work, and I'm sort of like interested because a lot of what is in this data set as being labeled as his is not his work. So what does this tell me? Well, this tells me that if I were to try to use Eric Niche as a prompt in my generator, I might not actually get the right results in here. So let's try this. Let's go in here into Stable Diffusion. Let's just type Eric Niche. I'll spell it right. And let's hit generate. And sure enough, I get an image that I don't know what that is. It's kind of an interesting image, but it's definitely not what I expected. So using this tool is really helpful because if you're unsure whether the data set even knows about what you're talking about, it's worthwhile to sort of go in here and just like quickly type in the search and see if it actually shows results that you would expect, right? So, I know maybe it's not great for flowers, so let's try hibiscus. Let's just see what I get when I see this. Okay, so I do have some hibiscus images. One of the things I noticed about this is not a lot of photographs, a lot of illustrations. So if I were to just ask for like, hey, show me an image of a hibiscus flower, I'm probably more likely going to get illustrations than I am a photo. So maybe I need to work that into my prompt. We'll come back to that as a concept. But again, this tool is just really helpful to just sort of see what's in the data set. Okay, so let's jump into prompt tips. So I've just sort of listed these, maybe sort of like most important to least important as we go through this, and we'll play with these as we go through them. So first, we talked about this one in week 1. You need to describe the visual scene. These models are not conceptual, or like if you ask for a concept, you won't always get back what you expect. So the classic example that we looked at was fork in the road. So when you ask for a fork in the road, and you ask these models for a fork in the road, you will not get a fork in the road. You will get a fork, a little utensil, and they'll be in the road, right? So we can actually visualize that. Let's actually look at that in Stable Diffusion. So come back over here and we'll type, let's do a fork in the road. And actually one thing I want to do, or one thing I want to mention here, because maybe we haven't touched on the real basics of how this tool works, is let's set a seed value. So a random seed is, remember that our model or our images always start with a noise, right? They start with noise, and then that noise gets converted into an image. If this seed is set to -1, that random noise is literally going to be random, meaning every time I run generate, I'm going to get a different random noisy image that starts the image making process. If I want to control that, and I actually want to like see, like maybe manage what seeds are being used, I want to use the seed tool. So for now, let's just start at 1, right? So that's going to basically every time if I were to run the exact same seed value, the exact same prompts, and the exact same settings in here, I should always get the exact same image, right? So that's really important to remember, is that all of these variables being set, you should always get the exact same image as long as this seed value is not -1. What that means is that, when we get an image we like, we can actually keep it and we can sort of tweak it as we go along. And that's really helpful because in this sort of randomized world where this was set to -1, it means every time I'd run this, I would get a completely different image. And if I really liked one and I was like, I love that image, but I want to tweak it a little bit, I could never get back to it. So I would say almost by default, always come in here and always set your seed to a value. And we'll talk about like changing that value and other things in a second. Next is batch count. So by default, this only generates 1 image. If I want to generate more than 1 image every time I run this, we can change the batch count. So let's change this to 4. What this is going to do is every time I run this, it's going to generate 4 images for me. Now, it's going to take a little bit longer to generate those images, but I'll actually see a bigger diverse range of what these images look like. The reason I want to do that is every one of these seeds might generate a slightly different image. And if I were to generate a fork in the road, maybe the one time I generate, it doesn't generate, it actually generates a fork in the road randomly somehow. I want to just see across the wide breadth of my images, am I always getting a utensil in the middle of a road? Or am I actually getting 2 paths sort of merging together? So let's set that there as well. And then I'll talk about like if you like one of these images, how to keep it or how to work off just that one. Let's go ahead and hit generate. Okay, so I now have a handful of images. The nice thing here is the first image is always the grid. So I can just sort of look at this. And sure enough, I don't actually, well, this one kind of looks like a spoon in the road. But for the other ones, I get basically just a road, right? So I don't even get a fork in the road. I literally just get a road. This is kind of one of the things you'll find with Stable Diffusion. It's actually not great at merging images together. And you kind of have to push a little bit. And we'll talk about how to do that in just a minute. But okay, I definitely did not get a fork in the road, right? I didn't get that sort of like two roads converging or separating. Now, if I want to just generate like maybe different images. So the funny thing, I learned about this earlier today. Usually what happens is when you set the seed to 1, these are all seed 1. They're just sort of sequenced, right? So if I like the second image, that's not seed 2 in most cases. But with this particular tool, it actually is seed 2. So if you like the second image, you can set this to seed 2 and set your batch back down to 1, and it will generate this exact image. That's kind of a nice thing that is not always true of every other tool. That's a nice way to sort of, again, speed up your processing time. So you could actually start with a batch of 10, pick your favorite, and then tweak from there. Or do a batch of 100, go to lunch, come back, and then pick your favorite and begin to operate just off that one, and that'll save you a lot of time. So I'm just gonna leave this at 1 because I want to keep looking at a couple different options here. So, okay, so a fork in the road didn't really work. How could I write this to be more explicit or specific and less conceptual? Can anyone think of like, what would be a text phrase that would actually give us 2 paths merging somewhere?
Intersection?
Yeah. So let's try this. Let's try 2 paths intersecting in a forest. So we'll go ahead and hit generate. Okay, so now we have paths in a forest, but we are not seeing 2 paths. Another thing that I've learned about Stable Diffusion, or actually these models in general, is they are bad at counting. Counting is not a strong suit of these models. For whatever reason, they like within the model system, asking for 3 paths will still give you 1 path. Asking for 10 paths might give you 10 paths of random, shapes and sizes, but they are not very good at explicitly denoting, pathing, or like how many am I looking for. We could try maybe a different word. So let's, instead of intersecting, let's try merging.
Yeah.
Let's see if it understands the concept of merging, right? This is kind of the fun or like the annoyance of these tools, is you have to try different phrases and see if that actually changes anything. So let's try 2 paths merging in a forest.
Derek, what about the philosophy of creating super long and very descriptive things?
I'll get there in a second.
Okay.
Yep, I'll get there in a second. Okay, well, merging didn't do much for us either. Now, this is where I would probably say, like, let's try a different seed. So I feel like I tried this earlier today. Let's try to sea of 10. So this is going to give me 4 different images, essentially. As long as I'm not doing 1 through 4, I'll get different images. And sometimes if you're like heart set on, I must get 2 images merging, you can just ask for more seeds or try different images. And one of them might randomly hit on like what you're looking for. Tomorrow, or like, I guess next week, we'll also look at maybe seeding this with a sketch that also might help get us what we want to get. Nope, still no images. So let's try one more time. Let's see if we do a seed of 20. Okay, close. We're getting closer, I guess. So in this example, you can see I've got 2 paths now. They're not splitting off. They're sort of, well, they are splitting off. So I guess, they're not merging. I guess I would almost say merging should be the reverse, right? It should be two paths merging into one. This is actually giving us probably more of the fork in the road. So again, because I jumped around and tried different things, I end up finding one that gave me what I wanted. But not every single seed is going to do that. So maybe for the remainder of this, let's just work off seed 20 and sort of work from there. So I'm gonna set my batch back to 1 because this will run a little bit faster. So the things for speed are how many sampling steps are you using? So if I crank this up and said 30, it would take a little bit longer. If I change my size and made my size bigger, it would take longer. And then batch count would also like require a longer processing time. So it's kind of good that if you know the image you want to work off of, or if this one is conceptually what you want to work off of, it'll be a little bit faster if you reduce batch count, and you could reduce steps too. I'm going to leave this I'm going to crank this up a little bit, just because I do want to see if I can get a little bit more detail out of this. Okay, so back to our concepts here. Next is order is really important. So this will become a bigger thing. So Nat mentioned length of the prompts. We'll come back to that or look at that next. But what I've seen sort of from everyone and how these models work is they definitely weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, the objects that are at the beginning of your sentences. So that really describes what's happening in the scene, right? So if you've seen prompt generators, they sort of say like, what objects are in the scene? Where is it located? What's the location? Those sort of things. So we've sort of already got that here, which is we've got 2 paths merging in a forest. We could say, let's try flipping this around. So say in a forest, 2 paths merge, right? There's a little bit more of a poetic way of saying this, but this maybe will emphasize the forest more, and I might lose my 2 paths. We'll sort of see. Okay, so actually this still worked. I definitely get a slightly different look. Now, when we get to very long prompts, this will make a little bit more sense. I've got a pretty short prompt here, so there's only a couple objects really looking for. But this is actually kind of good. I actually might like this image a little bit more. It kind of has the paths leading off into nowhere, which I kind of like, or like into some hidden areas. So let's leave this as is. What I have understood, or just like I've sort of seen people debate this. So there's 2 sort of debates. One is that the order of importance is beginning, end, and then middle. So anything in the middle of these longer prompts gets reduced in terms of like sort of effort or weight. And then beginning and end are sort of the second most important things. And then I've seen other people say like, no, it's just beginning, middle, end. Like it goes in that order. The other thing I would say is that the type of word or the word you use also tends to have a lot of weight. So we're going to look at some of the prompt hacks where you add styles and other names into these prompts. And you'll tend to find that certain prompts or certain words have a lot of weight and emphasis on these images. So it's kind of like order is most important, unless you throw in a really popular word or like a really big word that means a lot to this model. And that's kind of one of the challenges of these things, is understanding like, oh, if I try this like little prompt hack, how much does that overtake the image? Versus if I, just put in something else, like what does that do? So really quickly, I'm going to show a little bit of how that works. The little prompt hacks, we'll cover a little bit more. We'll come a lot more about that in a little bit. But I happen to know from earlier today, one really strong prompt hack is if you add in Kandinsky's name. So this is, go ahead.
Sorry, Derek. What about, so you used before the word merging, and this time you used the word merge. How flexible is the data set as far as understanding different variations of the same word, like connect versus connecting, or merge versus merging? Because merging is much more rare. So I wonder if there's any way of doing something similar to the search engine that you showed just now, that would actually go through the text prompts and list some sort of graph that shows how frequent a certain word is. I don't know. You understand what I'm?
Yeah, it's an interesting idea. I mean, what I would say is I will generally try it. You will almost always get slight differences in your images. Although I have to do a one-to-one comparison to see if these actually changed. I don't know that I see a big, strong difference. But sometimes like another thing to try is in a forest versus in the forest. Little variations like that will change your image. So it's worth trying those out. But yeah, I would say in general, or maybe in this case, I would say like, I don't think it has a huge difference. So I would always say like, try it. And you might be surprised what you find out, because it is kind of interesting to see how these models, what can change the language. You can also try adding punctuation. This will actually generate slightly different images. Let's try it with an exclamation point to see if we get something that's louder. I don't know. Yeah, that's interesting. So we actually lost our second path here by adding an exclamation point. Again, it's kind of confusing. Like, why does that happen the way it does? Something in the space says, hey, like, I've never seen someone shout about an exclamation point with two paths. I don't know. It's very confusing. This is part of the like learning how a machine thinks, which is kind of the like weird part of this whole process. So really quickly, I'm just going to add by Vasily Kandinsky, or is it Vasily Kandinsky? I never actually said his first name out loud. Kandinsky. Okay, flip those around. So I happen to know that this phrase has a ton of weight in terms of the visual output of this. So if I generate this, it's going to obliterate my photorealistic forest and turn it into a very abstract Bauhaus looking sketch. Yep. Now this is actually this is more forest than I've seen previously. So again, some words, even though this is at the very end of my prompts, I just happen to know from experimentation that this like has a lot of weight and it really changes the visual style of an image. And there are other prompts like this and other things like this that I think people can play with, and you'll find some of these things, man, they've got so much power over the image. And we'll talk about how to reduce that power or play with that power in just a minute as well. So again, order of operations is important, but it can sometimes be overpowered by other words, which is kind of like a challenge. It's like some of these things don't actually like, they contrast each other, or like they sort of, almost go against what you expect based on this order. But what I would say is, regardless, I'm still seeing in a forest. I actually think, so I had previously played with this example. Actually, let's just try it and see. This is actually running pretty fast now. So I had set up this, and I'm interested to see what happens when I run this, if I lose my forest. Okay, so I still have a forest there. This might be because of the seed. I'd previously run this and I almost lost all of the sort of like forest kind of look and feel in this image. The other thing I'll say it's nice about this web GUI is if you click into the text field and just hit Command Z, you can actually go backwards, which is nice. Not every tool operates like that. So it's nice that you can sort of like go back to your previous prompt if you want to. Okay, so again, order of operations sort of matters, but it can be overridden by like really powerful words. Does length matter? So this is Nat's question. I have literally heard differing opinions from every single person that plays with these tools. Some people swear that longer prompts work better. Longer prompts give you more nuance, they give you more detail, they just do more for you. Other people are like, I don't know, I put in a short prompt and I get a good image out. I don't know that there's actually like a steadfast rule. What I will say is people tend to prefer one or the other. I actually tend to prefer shorter prompts. I just think I have maybe a little bit more control over that because I'm not like throwing in a bunch of soup that I like don't know what's happening. So I tend to err toward the side of shorter. But we'll look at some tools that actually will give us a little bit more of control or like understanding about how each of these phrases adds to things. It's likely that the more you add, the more phrases you add, sort of the more nuance and like maybe almost more collage sort of feeling you'll get with these things, right? So when we talk about ethics, we'll talk about like, hey, you don't just want to put in a word and then say by an artist, because that's going to like almost inevitably give you like that artist's work with that image. So this is a case of where if you like throw in a bunch of different concepts, a bunch of different ideas, you'll likely get something that is a little bit new or like different than you might get with shorter phrases. But if you're not doing all those text prompt hacks or like adding in an artist's name, you might actually like get a good result with a shorter prompt. So I think it's a little bit, the jury's still out on length, but I've definitely seen people that like really love adding lots of concepts and ideas into their prompts, and other people that are just like, nope, give me a short one and I get a good result out. So again, it's kind of hit or miss. I would recommend people try both and see what they think works for them. And with that, I can also say there is a tool that we'll look at just a minute. So this is a tool called I'm going to drop this in chat for everybody. This is a text to image prompt generator. So let's go over here. Let's just copy. I don't really want the Kandinsky thing anymore. Let's just copy our path, or like in a forest, two paths merge. And let's go to this link. So you'll see here, we've got another hugging face. I'm kind of surprised it isn't built into the web GUI yet, but for whatever reason, it's not. So what is this? This is someone who took all of the prompts on Midjourney. So for anyone not familiar with Midjourney, Midjourney is a Discord tool. You join the Discord, I think you pay them something like $10 a month or a certain amount of credits. And you can use their Discord bot to feed it a text prompt and get back images. And they've added other features, that sort of thing. Someone went in and grabbed all of the prompts that someone generated in Midjourney, because it's an open Discord, or like a fairly open Discord, and grabbed all those prompts and fed that into a new GPT-2 model. So essentially what this does is you can stick in a little prompt, and it'll generate a long prompt for you. So let's go ahead and try this. So I'm just going to take in and paste in my prompt, and I'm going to hit compute. And you'll see here, it just keeps going. So it now has created a new prompt for me with a longer phrase here. So let's go ahead and paste this in to Stable Diffusion and see what we get. So interestingly enough, I lost my paths again. So for whatever reason, whatever we're adding here, well, I can see add one path and one path. So like, I guess it's, there's multiple one paths in here. So it's kind of changing maybe the idea here. So let's maybe remove that.
Do you want to get rid of the seed too? Just so it's fresh?
No, I want to keep the seed, because the seed is what I think was generating our two paths.
The two paths, okay.
So I want to keep that in and see if I can keep it. Apparently I can't. So again, sometimes these obliterate meanings. What I actually was kind of surprised is, usually you also get in some of those text prompt hacks, like Trending on ArtStation by Greg Rutkowski or whatever his name is. So the cool thing is, if you hit this again, it's just going to actually delete all of this text. If you hit compute again, it's just going to generate a new phrase for you. Interesting. Okay. Keeps not working the way I expect it to. So we'll copy this in and we'll see what this one does. Interesting. Now I'm actually getting two different images. And I'm getting this very strong light path and this other thing. So interesting. I'm going to try it. Let me just put in a different option here. So two paths merge in a dark forest. Compute. Here we go. Okay. This is what I was looking for. So when this model, like in this particular example, I've got a bunch of different little word hacks here, right? I've got wide viewpoint, forest, hyper realistic, 4K. So if those of you have seen this stuff before, these are all like these little word prompts that should maybe change the level of detail. It should change other elements in it. Now you'll also get this thing that says --AR 21.9. What the hell is that? So Midjourney, as a text tool, also has a bunch of built-in little functions that can change your output. So what this is actually doing is this is saying aspect ratio 21:9. So there's a little hack in Midjourney where you pass this in and it will change the shape of your image. Obviously, for Stable Diffusion, we don't want that. So one of the problems with this is that this really generates like Midjourney hacks. And we want to make sure we go through here and remove those before we paste them into Stable Diffusion. I don't know that it would change anything. Like it would probably just ignore it or would like dump it into a weird space that it would just sort of like be worthless. But from my perspective, I'm always like, I want to clear that out, just to make sure it's not influencing my image. So let's go ahead and take this text in now and paste this in. Okay, so now I've gotten this sort of interesting, I don't know what the hell this shape is in the middle. Maybe that's because of the hyperrealistic or 4K or something else. Oh, it's the portal in the center of the forest. That's our portal, I guess. So if you're ever just like, hey, let me just like throw the dice and figure out a random prompt to see if it generates anything cool, you can use this tool. I also think if you hit compute, it's just going to add more. Yeah, it just adds more. Okay, so let's delete this. Let's see if we can get more compute out of this. Okay, so if you just want more and more of these phrases, you can just keep hitting play and get more and more of our little text hacks. So let's try putting this in here. And you'll see maybe high resolution, maybe octane render, maybe some of these words are now giving me more and more detail. So it's starting to look more and more realistic. I bet you the concept art is actually the thing that's making it more realistic. But I've kind of lost my two paths. Now I just have one path that leads into like, I don't know, this glowing city or something. So again, as you add more and more phrases, you may lose the original idea or the original concept. And this can be kind of one of the challenges that I personally find with this. Now, again, if you're into like realism, whatever you added here made this image look a lot more realistic and a lot more concept art painting. I tend not to care about that stuff. That's not really what I look for. But I do think lots of other people are like, that's what they want, right? They want that realism that like, oh, I can never paint this myself, but this model can do it for me. I think that's why you see a lot of people dump a ton of different text prompt hacks into the end of this, because it does tend to create this more like realistic looking thing. So one thing I want to mention that I actually don't have in my notes, which I don't know why I didn't update my notes. Talked about weighting, again, WEIGHTING, over waiting, like waiting for a period of time. Different tools offer different kinds of weighting structures. So Midjourney has this thing where you can actually put in, I think it's something like this. It's like double colons, and then you can put in like 2.5. And this says, hey, I want to weight this image or this prompt, this part of the prompt stronger than other things. The web GUI itself does a different technique. So the way to weight an image, or the way to weight a little piece of text inside of your model, is to wrap it in parentheses. So let's say I really want to get my two paths back. One thing I might try is wrapping this in parentheses with the hope that like, what ends up happening is this then sends these weighted image or weighted words into the model. And the idea is like, this is weighted more heavily than everything else. So by doing that, maybe I'm going to get my two paths back. So let's just try it. Okay, there's maybe two paths there. You could argue that like, this is one path and this is one path. So that kind of works. And maybe, again, this is a way that I can start to play with this and be like, I really like the look of this image, or maybe I like the colors, or maybe I like the structure, but I'm still not getting exactly what I want object-wise. Now, the other thing you can do is like, let's say I'm still not getting two paths the way I want it. You can wrap this in more brackets, and that makes it stronger, even more stronger. Apparently, I believe in reading through documentation, one bracket gives it a weight of 1.1. So it's 1.1x stronger. You can wrap it in more brackets, and that does 1.1 times 1.1, which is like 1.2. I would say once you've got brackets in there, you don't want to worry about, like, I would personally not add more brackets. What you can do then is inside of your parentheses, you can actually do colon, and then you can do 2.0. So this actually says weight this 2 times stronger than all the other words. And if I do this, hopefully I really get 2 strong paths out of this model. Yeah, this is probably too much because it's actually influencing it so much that it's actually putting text in there. It's putting text in there that says 2. So this is a good example of where, like, okay, we've over-indexed on this. Let's scale it back a little bit. Let's do 1.25. Cool. So that made our paths a little bit stronger. And I would say there are 2 paths here. Maybe I don't like the visual structure of this, and maybe I would want to change up the seed. Like, let's actually try this. Let's see. Previously, we weren't getting 2 paths with a seed. Let's try 21 and just see if now that we've weighted this, we can now get a new image with two paths. I'd say teaching with stable is so nice because if I did this with Disco, we'd be waiting 5 minutes every time I generate an image. So it's really nice that it's only 15 seconds. Okay, so this still did not give me two paths. It might just be that the way the randomization works with this image or with this noise, that it doesn't really work with this image. So let's go back to 20 because that gave me my best two paths. Next week, we'll look at actually generating a structure for these images, which will be way easier. So that's weighting. One thing I could do is, let's say I really don't like a portal in the center of the forest. I want to keep it in there, but I want to like really reduce, like I don't know, maybe there's like a lot of portalness looking in this thing. Let's say I want to turn it down. You can do a reduced weight by wrapping this in parentheses again, and then doing our colon, and let's do 0.5. So now what we're saying is I really want to strengthen two paths, but I want to reduce the strength of a portal in the center of the forest. I don't want to remove it entirely, but I just want to reduce the overall strength that it has on the image generating. I don't really think it changed the image that much, but again, I guess maybe a little bit, it kind of added in some new detail here, which is maybe what I want. So you can play with reduced weighting and like positive weighting, and just sort of see if you can then, again, it's more about control, right? It's like, how do I tweak this in the way I want to do it? So one thing I'll show you is, this is something I worked on with the class earlier today. So I had literally like, I had this, and then I had photorealistic, or what was it? It was realistic photo. And then it was by Vasily Kandinsky. It's Vasily, isn't it? It's got to be Vasily. And I just keep butchering his name. Okay, so I added this in. And if we generate this without any weights, we're going to see that the Kandinsky thing really overpowers everything else. Right, so the Kandinsky thing is kind of overpowering the rest of this. We're getting kind of this interesting effect where we're getting sort of a mix of Kandinsky and maybe something that's photorealistic. But you can definitely see the blobbiness is sort of more Kandinsky. So here again, maybe what I want to do is, let's actually flip this around. Let's do photorealistic. Yeah, okay, so here's a good example. So apparently realistic photo gives you a little bit more photo, but in this case, because I'm using photorealistic, this image is really being weighted heavily by the Kandinsky phrase. So what I could do here is, let's turn Kandinsky down. Let's go 0.5. And let's hit generate. And now we're getting kind of, what's interesting here is like, this isn't really photorealistic, but I've got this sort of flat shading, or like there's maybe more of a Kandinsky style thing, but I'm also now getting some photorealistic textures, right? So again, by playing with weights, you can really sort of control a little bit more of the style of these images. And that's where I think, again, a lot of us are really more interested in control, right? I want to say like, hey, I want a little bit of this, but not too much. And that's where I think weights are really, really helpful and really important. Like let's say, I think there was another one, like let's say Tri-X, which should make all of our image black and white. Yep. So now what's really interesting here is, because of these little tweaks, I'm able to say like, I want a black and white, but I'm also getting all that grain. So Tri-X, for those of you unfamiliar, is a film type. And it's very popular because it has a lot of grain in it. So this converts it to black and white, and then it introduces grain. And now I've got a really interesting image because it's kind of abstract in the way that Kandinsky is, but I also now have a black and white image that has grain in it. And I'm still getting, I mean, maybe there's two paths. I could, again, maybe like say like, let's see if we can get two paths back in here. Interesting. Now where would have gone, but that kind of works, right? There are literally two paths, and I guess they almost become trees. Again, this is where it's kind of getting interesting. Like you can start to make up a phrase like, what is this conceptually saying? So I think weighting is a really, really important part of using these tools because again, you can sort of override some of the default sort of power of certain words in these phrases as a way to sort of begin to really manipulate these images into the way you want. And I think that's really like the power of this is like, as an artist, like, yes, I can just like throw in a random phrase or generate a GPT-2 phrase and get out something that's cool and interesting. But what if I really want to control these things? Then you need to learn all these little prompt hacks and that sort of thing. Okay, so we spent a lot of, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, one quick question. So what I think where it might be getting confused maybe is the plural. So it says two paths with an S. What if you just wrote two path or
Yeah,
something like that?
I'm always doing this bad thing of I'm trying to use like proper English when I'm writing this, and some of maybe these models don't care about proper English.
Mm-hmm. I'm curious. I have no idea whether it would be helpful or not.
Oh, interesting. Just by removing the S, I get something that's maybe a little bit more like illustrative. Again, this is kind of the funny thing about this. Like, why would removing an S give you this image versus the other one? But that's kind of how they go.
Okay.
Yeah. Cool. Okay, so let's see. So prompt hacks. So we talked a lot about this. Prompt hacks are generally the idea that like, remember that our data set has been scraped from across the internet. And what tends to happen is it scrapes from popular websites. So say DeviantArt, which is a very popular sort of website for like, I don't know, it's like DeviantArt. So it's more like, you know, illustrative images for like more punk rock people or like heavy metal or whatever it is. So if you add the phrase, I don't know, we'll try this. If you add the phrase DeviantArt into this, and let's remove Triax because Triax probably like really grayscales the hell out of everything. Let's remove photorealistic. And you know what, let's just remove all this stuff. Let's just say just DeviantArt. Interesting. Okay. Not necessarily what I expected. But anyway, what happens is in these models, they have sort of learned what certain websites or certain types of, you know, communities look like. So a really popular one is if you add the text prompt trending on ArtStation, and you can actually look up what ArtStation looks like. If you go to artstation.com, you'll see there's lots of art that looks like this, right? So lots of, you know, concept art, maybe some 3D art, a lot of these sort of glowing, you know, digital illustration kind of looks. So if you add trending on ArtStation, which is a very, very common prompt hack, you will get something that looks like this. And the idea is like, well, that kind of introduces some ethical problems here, right? Because like, we just scraped a bunch of art from one person's from this website, and we're sort of glomming all the ideas together into what it looks like. And maybe the artists who are on ArtStation don't want their art included in this data set. We'll come back to this, but it's something worth knowing that the way these prompt hacks work is they kind of are looking for stylistic ideas that combine together. And therefore, when you enter that in, you're asking for the sort of like generalized idea of what that looks like, right? So Triax. Triax being a very popular film type. I'm sure if you go on Flickr, a ton of images are tagged with Triax because Triax is a very popular film type. So people shoot that, they add Triaxes to let people know that they use Triax film for it. And therefore the model learns that Triax means black and white and grainy. So I think I've shared this before, but I'll share this again. During the times of EQGAN and Disco Diffusion, lots of people said like, well, hey, why don't we just document every one of these text prompts we can find, or these prompt hacks? So there's this person, Kingdom Acrylic. They did so much work here. I'll drop this in the chat for people to look at. So what they have here is this is using VQGAN. So this is not Stable Diffusion. So just FYI about that. What they have here on the top is the object of mushroom, spaceship, volcano, and Victorian house on a hill. And then along the side is they have all of these different text prompt hacks. So 8K resolution, pencil sketch, 8K 3D, Unreal Engine, photo illustration, Pixiv, Flickr. And you can kind of see that for a lot of these, there is some sort of, you know, overwhelming sort of style that gets added when you do this. So HDR adds in a lot of this sort of glowing shape to things. Ambient occlusion makes everything sort of grayscale. I think Triax is probably in here somewhere as well. Rendered in Maya or rendered in C4D. Like you can see, like, do people in Maya render things in a certain way compared to Cinema 4D? So there's a whole bunch of these text prompts. And if you were to use these in Stable Diffusion, I think you would see some fairly similar concepts, but they might be slightly different because Stable Diffusion is a different model and trained differently. But you can see here that there is a ton of options and ton of things worth exploring. So we'll look at after our break is actually how to use this in a thing called prompt matrix to play with it. There are other ones here that are artistic styles. So say, what does abstract expressionism look like versus American modernism? Or individual artists, what does each artist look like? And here again, we're sort of getting into this area of like some ethical problems, but we'll talk about that in a little bit. So just be aware that there is a ton of opportunity here to play with this. And lastly, I'll also say, there's a video that I released last week on Clip Interrogator. For those of you that watch that, you'll know that what Clip Interrogator allows you to do is allows you to upload an image, any image you like. And what it does is it will tell you sort of what keywords Clip would use to describe this image. So what you're going to do is you're going to reverse engineer, say upload an image that is a really cool 3D art thing. And it says, oh, use Octane Render and Maya. Then I can use those and put that in my own image, my own text prompts, and hopefully get out images of a similar style. Doesn't always work perfectly, but it does sort of point you in the right direction. So again, I won't cover this, but it's covered in the video that I released last week. So if you want to check that out, you can. All right, let's take a little break. So let's do like a 8-minute break, 9-minute break. So let's come back at 10 till, and we will jump into using prompt matrix. All right, so I'll see everyone in a couple minutes. All right, so let's take a look at this. So basically, like, we might want to try to regenerate some of that Kingdom acrylic grid, right? Like, let's say, like, hey, I've got an image prompt and I want to see it in 8K. I want to see it trending on ArtStation. I want to see it with all the various other prompt tags. The way you used to do this is you would actually literally put them in one by one and then generate them and then put them into Photoshop and create a grid of them. A cool thing that has sort of happened is now we can actually, there are some tools that actually will do this for us. So we're going to look at one of them. It's called Prompt Matrix. It is built into the web GUI, which is another reason why I like using this tool, because it makes some of this really easy. I found out about this because if you go to the Auto 1111 web GUI docs, which are on this page, drop this in the chat for everybody. This covers a lot of the techniques and options and other things that are available inside of this web GUI. We will cover a lot of these starting next week because I think there's a lot of cool opportunities in here. But if you want to, you can read through this and see that there are a ton of options. So we're going to look at next is prompt matrix, but you'll see there's way, way more in here. And I feel like this is where every week they're adding new features in here. So we'll definitely cover a couple of these. I also plan on covering a video on YouTube that just goes through a bunch of these options. So hopefully I can get to that this week and I'll share that with everybody. So inside the web GUI, there's a ton of options and other things to play with, many of which we'll not get into in this class. Just reading through this, I'm like, wow, this is a 7-week class in and of itself, just to go through all these features. So I definitely recommend if you're interested in playing around, like read through this and you can kind of see some interesting options. So we are going to look at the prompt matrix, which is, keep scrolling here. Okay, so prompt matrix. So let's just read through the docs. So separate multiple prompts using the pipe character and the system will produce an image for every combination of them. For example, if you use a busy city street in the modern city, pipe, illustration, pipe, cinematic lighting prompt, there are 4 possible combinations, right? So that is the initial prompt with no prompt tags, and then the illustration prompt tag, the cinematic lighting prompt tag, and then all of them combined. So what it'll generate for us, it will generate an image that gives us this, right? So let's look at setting that up for us. So we'll go back over to Stable Diffusion. And let's go into, I think this was the text prompt that we got a good one from, right? So let's copy this text prompt in here. And let's put it into Stable Diffusion. And I'm just going to clean this up because, so this takes a long time to process, right? Because it's processing one image for every one of these potential combinations. So just to keep class moving a little bit, I'm gonna trim this down. So instead of there's like 4 or 5 options in here. I'm actually just gonna let's pick a couple of these. So let's remove this. So let's do hyperrealistic. Let's do octane render. And let's do concept art. So instead of using commas here, let's convert them to pipes. So what is this going to do now? What it's going to do for us is it's going to take the initial phrase, which is our object, and it's just going to render that. Then it's going to render this phrase with the hyperrealistic tag. Then it's going to render it with octane render and concept art. And then it's going to give us a mix of all the potential options that could be combined together. So the way to do this is once we've got our prompt sort of restructured, so we're using pipes instead of commas, we're going to scroll down the bottom of this page and you'll see under here there's script. And we're going to switch script to prompt matrix. Once we've done that, we can go ahead and hit generate. You'll see my ETA was a little bit longer than it usually is. And when we finish here, what I should get is a grid of images. So usually what happens here is when you select one of these from this output, it will always end up showing that first image over and over again. So you can just hit that little X button to go back. And then what I tend to find works well is let's just say open image in new tab. So, and here's what we get. So in this case, my seeded image with just that phrase, I get this image. So this is sort of the most natural looking one. When I add hyperrealistic to this phrase, I get this image. It's actually looking less hyperrealistic to me, but so it goes. When I add octane render, I get something that looks like this. And when I add octane render and hyperrealistic, I get this image. Kind of interesting that like some of these things are bringing the paths back in and some of them are removing it. So again, it's kind of all these things all like float and interoperate with each other. And down here, I've got concept art. So this is just our initial phrase with concept art. This is hyperrealistic plus concept art. This is octane render plus concept art. And then this is all 3 of them. So if I were to go back and just convert those pipes back to commas, I would get this image. So that took a minute. You could imagine like build up a whole bunch of options, run it, go out to lunch and come back. And you've got, a matrix of 50 options that you could then sort of go through and say like, oh, I really like that image. What combination made that? Okay, this plus this plus this. This again also allows you to begin to generate maybe something like that Kingdom Acrylic page, where you could say, here are a bunch of text prompts I think that are little hacks, like, oh, let me add DeviantArt, let me add Flickr, let me add other websites that I think might have cool, interesting artwork styles and see if the model knows about them, right? So you might want to play with have I been trained on versus, grab some ideas from there and then bring them in here and try some text prompt hacks. I think it's a really powerful tool. It's kind of a fun thing that you don't get with other tools. And allows you to really explore lots of different options without having to go in and render each one by one, which is a pain in the ass. So again, a really cool tool I would definitely recommend for this week playing with this because, you might see like, oh, I really like low poly. Like low poly gives me a really cool look and feel. I think you could also begin, I've never tried this before. I think you could also add in weights. So let's try this. I think you could do something like, I'm going to reduce this or remove one of these just to make it a little bit easier for us. I think you could even say concept art, and let's try making this stronger. Not entirely sure this will work, but let's try it.
And you always want to do this with the same seed?
No, you could switch up the seed. I
Okay.
would say it's probably easier if you're going to compare a bunch of these like apples to apples. to use the same seed, right?
Okay.
It's really like apples to apples is how you want to do seeding. But if
Right.
you're just like, hey, I want to see this across 10 different images and see if it has the same effect on every image because of the noise, you might want to do like run this once on seed 1, run this again on seed 2, and see how it changes the output and the effect of things.
Okay.
Okay, interesting. It looks like it does take weighting into consideration as well. So you could even say, like, maybe I just want to look at weights, right? You could say concept art. I don't know if this is actually this is probably not the best way to do the matrix thing, but it would work. Let's say 0.5. The problem is your like duplication or your one that combines stuff is going to be like concept art 0.5 and concept art 1.5, and that might not really work that well. So you could play with this and sort of see if you could generate the right grid for different options there. But I think it's a really cool and powerful tool, and you can combine this with the GP2 generator. You can combine it with looking at have it been trained on. You could use the clip interrogator to really build up a whole array of different styles and options, and then begin to view them all, in separate, in isolation, and combine, and like, you could have a pretty cool tool that would give you a lot of options for control. And again, I think that's really the key for this class is like, not just making a cool image, but like, okay, I want to tweak a little bit. I want to change it. How do I maintain control over these things and isolate the right elements? And I think that's where this tool really allows you to begin to isolate, the various pieces of the elements you want to use. So I definitely recommend checking out this tool and playing with it more. You can also look at that, this features. There's some other options I think we might look at as well. There's one I saw in here that was called XY plot. Creates a grid of images with varying parameters. Select which parameters you should be shared by rows and columns using X and Y type fields. So this is kind of cool. I haven't really played with this yet, but it looks like you could play with the configuration scale, right? So you could say the CFG scale is how strong the text prompt has an influence on your image. So you kind of see like, as you crank this up, you get a very different look as this influences the image. So again, this might be a fun tool to play with. I haven't really played with it too much. It looks like you can define the X and Y parameters and then begin to play with this. So again, there's a ton of tools in here that I think could really allow you to sort of see how different variables control different effects of the image. So a ton worth playing with in here. And again, this features documentation looks pretty thorough. So it might be worth sort of digging through and playing with a little bit this week. Again, I'll probably try to get to another YouTube video to record on just sort of some of the features that stand out the most to me in here. And we'll definitely look at some of these next week when we look at image to image and video tools. All right, so that's pretty much it for text prompting. Any questions about this? Anything that I didn't cover you're interested in learning about? Anything else any questions I can answer about all the text prompting features? Okay, fine if not. Maybe you just need to play with it right more, and then you'll start to have questions. So the last thing I want to talk about today is I really want to talk about ethics, because I think now that we've sort of looked at all the options and things we could do within these, what's the right thing to do, or what's a way to think about like what the right and wrong way to approach some of these tools are? As you've probably seen, if you're anywhere on the internet, Reddit, Twitter, wherever, you'll see that there's a lot of the anti-text to image. There's a big backlash against text to image tools, right? And there are people that are saying like, oh, you're just stealing other people's artwork and using it for your own purposes, right? These models are collage tools. All they do is cut and paste things and put them back together. I have often described these tools as collaging, but I've never meant it literally. I've never meant like it takes a Kandinsky, cuts out a section and pastes it back into the image, right? I think these as conceptual collage tools. They are, as we saw with that image where we're combining Tri-X and Kandinsky and changing the weight of the Kandinsky, what you get out of it is not a Kandinsky in the end, or not a photograph, but you get a mix of the two. And that is sort of what I think is the power of these tools. But because of the hype cycle of these things, you've got people saying like, oh, you're stealing. And you've got other people saying like, this will change everything about art forever and ever. And like, it's just kind of annoying, because we're in this hype cycle where like people just love picking a side and then really indexing on that side. So for example, you may have seen this guy. I think he's like a CEO tech bro kind of dude. He posted this thing that like, there's no doubt that using these tools is making like real art. I spent an hour and a half tweaking these things to produce these visuals. So I guess he's assuming real art is totally about how much time you spend on things, instead of, I don't know, some other concept or other way to approach art. Kind of annoying, right? Like, and he posted this thing like, there's a real soul to these images that I can't get from other things, which of course just pissed off artists like you wouldn't believe. So he wrote this thing, and he also posted an image of what his text prompt was. And of course, immediately someone said this and say like, hey, you added by Greg Rutkowski in here. So clearly you're just stealing from that guy, right? Like clearly what you're doing here is just stealing from other artists, and the images being output are based on what you're stealing from. And it's just like, here's how I feel about this. Here's the thing, they're both wrong. They're both like, these are both incorrect assumptions about what these tools do. Yes, the tech bro used Greg Rutkowski's name and made it sound like he was sort of solving art. He is now like, use this tool, and now he's an artist and he demands respect as an artist. But the reply also said like, well, hey, like you're stealing from that artist. But again, if you go to Have I Been Trained On and you look up Greg Rutkowski's art, you will see in there that there are no portraits. There are no portraits in his artwork. So when someone says, oh, you're just stealing the person's art, it's kind of not, it's not true. There are some photos of people, but there's certainly no portrait that looks like this, right? And again, this is where we get into this world of like, he's got 30 different text prompt tags in here. What are they contributing to this image? Probably lots of little nuances here and there. Also, he uploaded another image to get this image out of it. So it's like, we'll talk about that more next week, but like, there's a bunch of stuff that is like very confusing or maybe ethically, like morally ambiguous about like, wait, what did he actually do to produce this image? Besides spend an hour and a half changing text prompts, right? And I think this is the problem with this hype cycle is you've got people who say like, this changes everything. All old artists are now obsolete and the AI art is taking over everything. And you've got other people that are like, this is purely theft, and anyone that's an AI artist is an evil person and deserves to be executed or whatever. And the reality is it's somewhere in the middle. Like neither of these sides are right, and being asked to pick a side and somehow fight for that side is kind of bullshit. So what I want to talk to you about is just like, here's how I think about these ethically. Here's how I approach these tools and how I work through them. And I've got some examples that I'll show you, just like my sort of framework for this stuff. And Emily is here, and Emily has written some other guides on the ethics of data set creation and other things. So we have some other experts here, other people that can weigh in and how they might approach this. And, first I'll say I'm not a lawyer. This is not legal advice. I don't think we've really seen any lawsuits happen with this stuff yet. I'm sure it's close to happening because I saw someone make a Disney data set. And it's like, you touch Disney, the Disney lawyers are going to come out in full force. So I think maybe we'll eventually get a lawsuit that actually tells us what some answers are here. But I approach this sort of like, okay, think before you type. What am I trying to do? How should I think about that? And other things there. This is my personal approach. I kind of take I would say, a centrist approach. There are other people who are probably more conservative and probably other people who are more liberal in how they approach these things. So my first thing is I think context matters a lot. Here in the US, we actually have laws that have said parody is a legal form of what might be considered copyright infringement. But if you are parodying or criticizing the thing you are using, you often have more legal leeway. Whether a Disney lawyer, and there are millions and millions of lawyers, could change that, I'm not sure. But I do think context matters, right? Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, style transfer was like the big ML tool. And all these apps came out where you could take a selfie of your face and you could apply the Starry Night texture to your face. And it's sort of like, what's special about Starry Night besides the fact that everyone knows what the image looks like, right? So context matters. What are you using these styles for? Is it purely just for, hey, I want to adopt a cool style and I want to make my thing look like that? Or are you using styles as a way to actually say something about your work? So again, I'll show you some of my work. I'm not saying my work is the best thing imaginable, but I am saying like, I approached it with this in mind. So I think I showed this project in week 1. This is a number of horror film scenes that have then had the Scream texture or the Scream, Edvard Munch's The Scream applied to it. And for me, like, this is where context matters, right? If I were to apply, I don't know, Greg Rutkowski's work to this, it wouldn't have the same sort of contextual importance that it does, right? What I'm trying to say here is like Edvard Munch's The Scream, which is from the 19th century, could be connected all the way up to the film that we make today, where we have these like, really like close crop scream scenes, right? And that's sort of what I'm trying to do here. Other people will approach concept art as a different way, but for me, this is a way to contextualize why I'm choosing the certain styles I'm choosing. Next idea is punching up versus punching down. I don't know how many people are familiar with this concept, but this is sort of like comedy, right? So in comedy circles, there's this idea of punching up, which would be like making fun of politicians, making fun of celebrities, making fun of people who are like famous and like, in many ways are, the most powerful people in the world, versus punching down, which would be more like picking on trans people or picking on Black people or other folks who like are in a much less privileged situation. So if we apply this to art, it's sort of like, am I picking a style from like an artist who, is still grinding out day to day, like trying to make a living and just has a Patreon page. And I've gone ahead and just picked their style up and now I'm applying that to all my work. And now it's my style, or like the way I approach is my style. Compared to like, say, using Picasso or I don't know, Jeff Koons, someone who's like a very famous artist today. And like, again, it's back to that context thing of like, if I want to make fun of Jeff Koons and his artwork, like I might use a Jeff Koons sort of prompt and see what I get out of that. So I think it's a little bit of, again, thinking about like, where do I sit in this context? Like when I was explaining this earlier to my ITP class, right? If you can afford to go to NYU and you can afford to go to ITP, you have a certain level of privilege and you should recognize that and acknowledge that, stealing from an artist who is maybe, just trying to get their feet on the ground and trying to make a living might not be the way to approach it. You might want to think about who you're taking from. I don't know anything about how much money Greg Rutkowski makes, but I know everyone uses his phrase. I know he's also very upset about it. So again, it's like, maybe if an artist has said like, hey, I prefer you to not use my prompts in your phrase, we should respect that. My next thing, which is just a general rule for me, this applies to also like books and other things, is dead artists are fair game, living artists are more of a question mark, right? Again, a living artist is probably trying to make a living. If they're really famous, maybe they're already making a lot of money, but most living artists are, scraping by or barely making a wage. Dead artists, like a Picasso or whatever, like, I don't really care. Like their family is probably doing fine. Whatever their foundation is, they're probably doing fine. So, my approach is I'll gladly steal from a dead artist because they've already made their money's worth. With one exception, if they literally just died this week, do not use their like artwork and do not post that. Someone literally did this very recently, where like a manga artist or someone died, and like that hour, somebody's on there making AI art that's like, look at this cool AI art made of this artist, and people are just like, what the fuck? What are you thinking? Like, people are hurting. Don't do this. So again, my rule of thumb is be smart about this shit. Like, don't just go ahead and say like, oh, this person just died. Time for me to cash in and make a bunch of AI art. Please don't do that. Like, silly. I don't think anyone here would do that, but like that's like a common thing for me to think through. My next sort of prompt is like, I have a cascade of how I would approach something like picking from an artist, right? So as we saw, there's lots of styles, right? Concept art, fantasy illustration, abstract expressionism, Bauhaus, modernism, whatever. I sort of would be like, let me start with a style and see if that gets me to where I want to be. If that works, then that's cool. It's kind of like probably a bunch of artists operate in that style. From there, cascade down, like let's say, I don't know, modernism is too broad. Let me maybe pick a couple modernist artists that I would want to, sample from. Not just one, but like a couple. Like, maybe, I don't know, Moholy-Nagy and Kandinsky and a couple other people that are maybe Bauhaus guys that maybe like Paul Klee. Maybe those guys have like a similar style that I want to sort of get to. And I would use those 3 or 4 phrases together. I think, again, styles is like the least concerning because you're sort of saying like, give me just like what a bunch of people make. Multiple artists would be like the next round where you're kind of getting that to that conceptual collage. What is the similarity between Paul Klee, Kandinsky, and Moholy-Nagy, right? Like what is sort of in the middle there that like kind of gives me something interesting? And lastly, I would say like, yes, you can use a single artist, but be careful about that because more than likely you're going to get a lot of effect from their one image, right? So if I were to say like, for a scene by Greg Rutkowski, that is going to get really close to what his work actually is. And you kind of, I mean, I would say personally, I want to avoid that, right? Like I should be trying to make something new that isn't just like, hey, this model can generate multiple Rutkowskis. That's cool. Like that's kind of, as an artist, I would feel like that's not really mine. That's like Greg's, or like that's somehow like a variation on Greg's work. And I want to make work that's mine. So this is how I would approach it, is just like, as you cascade down, you can kind of get a different sense of that. So here's another project that I did. This uses a number of artists who are from what's called the Transcendental Art Movement. So a bunch of people in the Southwest of the US. So I think like there's one called Agnes Patton. There's a couple other people. If you Google it, you'll sort of see some artists there. I used a bunch of their artists, like a bunch of their names in this process to generate sort of a collage. They all have a similar style, but even within that style, there's some changes. So I utilized that as a way to sort of get to that look and feel for all of them without saying like, I'm only using Agnes Patton or I'm only using like this particular artist. And for me, this kind of feels like, again, maybe getting closer and closer to maybe ethically like questionable, but because it used 5 or 6 different artists, I felt like it was in a range where it had a style and a look without getting too close to any one of those artists. So you get these nice, beautiful colors that I sort of like love. That's sort of like one of the things I really enjoy about their particular art movement. But they also have some people that are doing more abstract work and some people that are doing more figurative work. And you get sort of a different mix of these things. So again, for me, this was like still within like fair range. I also thought one of the funny things that happens with this is because you say by so-and-so, comma, by so-and-so, comma, by so-and-so, the model actually thinks you want like a grid of images, right? This is actually like what it's probably seen as maybe collaged or like grouped images from like an art house or an art gallery, where it's like, this one's by this person, this one's by this person, this one's by this person. So you actually get this kind of beautiful grid. So somebody I think previously had asked me like, how did you make this grid? And it just kind of came naturally from using a text prompt that was by so-and-so, comma, by so-and-so, comma, by so-and-so. So you kind of get these interesting sort of effects when you also play with these things. So this is just, again, my approach. Someone else might look at this and be like, whoa, way too close to transcendentalism of like Southwest, like not for me, or like too close, too on the nose. And that's kind of what's fun about this, is everyone can sort of define their own range. Okay, so the last thing I'll say is, I've sort of touched on this earlier, beware of your privilege. A lot of us are white on here. I would probably avoid using famous Black artists, right? Who might have a certain style or a certain context for their work, right? If they're African-American, it might be that they're, painting images of being a slave or being poor or growing up during Reconstruction. And if you just go ahead and grab their name and drop it in your image, you might be, again, sort of context matters, right? You might be grabbing something for a stylistic purpose, and instead you're grabbing something that is now about context. So again, it's really important to I think one of the things I hear is sort of funny about these things is people who are not really into art before they get into these tools are like, man, I got to learn all this stuff about artists. I have to learn this artist and this artist and this artist. It's kind of cool. Like, I like that. I like that people have to learn about art history in order to use these tools. But sometimes they're just like, I like the look of that thing, and they don't research like, oh, what was the art about? Oh, it's about slavery. Oh, maybe I should have rethought that, right? So most of us are probably artists here. Most of us have had some art history background. But again, thinking about like, oh, if I'm using this particular artist, did it turn out they were really into the Nazis, or like, were they a Nazi in 1945? Maybe I should avoid using them if I'm talking about this particular topic, right? So again, you kind of have to go in and do your research. What does this artist mean? What was this movement, right? So if you're going to go in and do futurism, you might want to learn that a lot of futurists became fascists in Italy, right? So like, all this sort of stuff, it matters, because when you start exposing your art to other people, they say like, whoa, you're using fascist work in your art. Like, are you a fascist? And you're like, oh God, I don't think so. Like, what happened here, right? So again, because we're sampling from other places, we need to know what those samples mean to different people. And that, I think, is really important to remember as we utilize this work. And lastly, I'll just say, like, I think a really key thing here is don't be a jerk. There are so many people that use these tools that quite honestly, come from a tech background, and their post is like, this is going to obsolete all art, and now I'm the artist, or like whatever, or like, this is going to put filmmakers out of business because I can make a film in an hour using these tools. And it's kind of like, dude, one, no, you can't. This film is a piece of shit. Two, like, it's worth acknowledging that there is a debt to this work, right? Because they have taken from all across the internet. We've included a lot of artists in their work in these pieces. So I think it's important to acknowledge that this could not happen in a vacuum. If there were no art ever in existence on the internet, this model could never exist. So I think it's really important to acknowledge that, like, I am using these tools, trying to find my own artistic merit, acknowledging there's a bunch of artistic debt being paid when using these tools. And lastly, I'll say, I think it's important, like, there's been a lot of infighting within this community about whether it's okay to keep your prompt to yourself. I don't really want to get into the world of, like, I keep my prompts for me and I never share them. People can do what they want to do, but I think it's actually very helpful in the context of ethics about sharing your prompts so people can see, like, oh, you use Greg Rutkowski in this? Well, what actually did that contribute to? Or, oh, you use this other artist. Well, let me go on Have I Been Trained and type in that artist's name. How close is this to the actual output of the image? Because I think there is this idea from many traditional artists that these models collage things and they just steal things and paste them into a new shape. And I think it's actually important that if you say, like, hey, here's the prompt I used, go look up this artist on Have I Been Trained, and you'll see these are not exactly the same thing. I think that's important to highlight. And I would imagine, like, publishing your prompts is actually a good way to counteract sort of that assumption that you are stealing from people. Other people are like, I don't want to share my prompt because then someone can make my image and then they're stealing from me. And it's sort of like, wow, we're like stealing from now. We're like in like this weird cascade of like what theft is. And those people can keep that feeling. But from my perspective, it's like sharing the prompt I used will help other people sort of see, like, oh, there's a cool style here, but like it's really overpowering and too close to the original. How can I tweak it? Is it weighting? Is it adding a different like text prompt included in there? That sort of thing. So I sort of think, like, one way to be ethical about this is to be a little bit more open about it, right? And we all sort of have like said, like, we love open source tools, and then to be like, we love open source tools, but I won't open source my process. It's sort of like, interesting. You like benefiting from open source, but you don't want to share your own process. And again, those people can do what they want to do. My own framework says I will share. If you'll ask, like, hey, what prompt did you use? And if I remember it, I'll be like, oh, here's what I used. Or I'll be like, I think I used something like this. Or like, here's an artist name I reference, that sort of thing. So this is just sort of my framework. I think for me, it's at least allowed me to have conversations with people who are like, did you just steal this? And it's like, no, well, look at this image and then look at what their artwork is, right? Like, compare those. Yes, you can see stylistic similarities, but it's not one-to-one. Or like, here's how I'm combining ideas. So for me, it's like, I want, here's my main framework. If I were to say, like, I'm using Greg Rutkowski's work, I wouldn't want Greg Rutkowski to see my image and be like, you just stole that from me, right? Like, I'd want someone to say, like, oh, that's interesting that you use my style, but it doesn't look like my kind of thing. Like, that's more of like oh, I understand you're not just ripping me off. Like, there is something else going on here, and we could have a conversation about like what that difference is. Or they're like, ooh, that looks really close to my thing. It's just a little different, but it's still really close. Like, that makes me feel weird. And I'd be like, oh, okay, let's have a conversation about that, So my general framework is, if an artist actually saw me using their prompts, would they feel weird or like put off by my work? And I think this sort of all helps me explain to someone that they like wanted to come up and fight me, how I would like defend myself, without resorting to fists or whatever. So this is my framework. I'm definitely open to hearing from other people what they think would work well or not. But so far, this has at least helped me feel good about the work that I'm producing. Not to mention stuff like, I don't necessarily take the raw output from these models, right? I bring them into Photoshop, or I add other things on top of it, or I'm doing additional tweaks to it. Like, that's all even outside of this world of like, am I doing more to the images than just purely like generating out of text prompts? Any questions about this or any thoughts? Yeah, go for it, Nat.
Yeah, so I was just thinking there's sort of a parallel with sampling in music.
Yep.
We've sort of dealt with this a little bit before. You're creating something new. So we already know that sampled music isn't just taking the same old thing and not putting anything else on top of it. It's actually creating something new by combining a sample of something with something, whatever else you're putting on top of it. So
Unless you're
there's
Diddy.
like, yeah, exactly. Unless, yeah.
I mean, and that is sort of like, so I come from like, in high school, I was very much into beat making. I did a lot of sampling. So I come from like that sort of aesthetic as well, which is like, I want to make something new with this work, not just like take this one loop that I really like and just loop it over and over again and like not add anything to it. That's kind of been my approach. But like, yeah, there are sampling artists like Puff Daddy who like literally just ripped off entire songs. And like, I think people felt weird about that. It just felt very different. And like he paid a lot of in copyrights or whatever to like actually make it happen. But you know, most of us are not paying for 20 grand in copyright or whatever with things. But yeah, I think there are some parallels. I think there's always a little bit of a difference here because, you know, this is not just a raw wave file that you're copying and pasting, but there's other things. And yeah, I think, you know, Rebecca, you're also mentioning like there's revival references. There's, you know, like how every 30 years or 60 years, we go through a recycling of old things. And that comes up again here as well. And I think, you know, if you look at someone like, you know, one of these painters, it's like, well, what are their references, right? And I think some ways people have set up a defense mechanism of, well, artists sample too, they just don't admit it. Or like artists have references in their head and they just don't show it. And I would say like, that's still different than this. And I think far too often we're like, especially AI artists try to be on the defensive, like, oh, well, you do it too, you just don't admit it. And it's like, well, it's still different. Like, I think we can acknowledge those differences. And it should be like, I would prefer we have a more open dialogue about what these tools actually do. And, you know, if you're using a text prompt in a certain way, you might actually get back a different answer. Yeah. Interpolation versus sampling, right? It's like, am I replaying this in a different way? Or am I changing the key of it or that sort of thing? Or am I chopping it up so I just have like individual notes that I'm then replaying in different ways? Like all these things are applicable. They're slightly different, but they're applicable.
It's interesting. If this wasn't open source and if it was centralized, then you could create a system somewhat like Spotify, where every time you used an artist's name, they could get a certain amount of royalties, perhaps, you know, then you could come up with some kind of system where they could get tips or royalties depending on how many times somebody used their name. But because it's open source, you can't control it in that sense. So, yeah.
Well, and I think if you ask musicians if they would like if they like the Spotify model, they'll tell you, no, the Spotify model sucks. I get paid 1.0001% of a cent every time I get played, right? I do actually think, yeah. So Adam mentions Shutterstock is actually trying that. So Shutterstock is saying if your images are used in our new AI model that we're training, we will pay you a royalty. It'll probably be pittance. I think everyone's trying to figure out what this actually means. I would say open source in this case is actually helpful for us because I can actually go in and look up that data set and say like how much of Greg Rutkowski's work is in this data set. Whereas
And
with DALL-E,
yeah.
OpenAI's model, we don't even know what it was trained on. So we can't even say like what's in there. Yeah.
Plus he's getting so famous. I mean, he could even just sell t-shirts now with his name on it and people would probably buy some. So yeah.
Yeah.
I'm the real Greg Rutkowski. Or how this is how you pronounce it and then spell it out or something like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyone else have other thoughts on ethics or, you know, have you seen anyone else write about this or talk about it?
What I find really weird about everyone saying that this is collage is that it's actually really bad at doing actual collage. Like I've just been sitting here trying to like do prompts with like collage artists and it cannot figure out what to do. It does not know how to mix paint and photograph. It really doesn't. Like collage is the worst possible example that people can pull from to kind of describe this process.
Yeah. And I think that the downside is like, you know, people could just open up one of these tools and type in two different artists, you know, contrasting artists, and you'll see it doesn't cut and paste.
It's not copy and pasting.
It's trying to, yeah.
They think that it's copy and pasting and that's not what it's actually doing. So, yeah.
But there are some, I mean, it's almost scarier what it is doing, right? It's actually like taking your style and pulling your style out and then applying that to new objects, which is far more frightening. I mean, Style Transfer tried to do that 5 or 6 years ago, and it was generally a failure. It rarely worked the way it was supposed to. Here we're actually to a place where it almost does work the way you would want it to, which is almost more frightening because now I can say like, hey, Greg Rutkowski never made portraits, but now I'm a portrait Rutkowski maker, you know? Like that's almost worse. So I actually think like sometimes you're doing a disservice by saying it's collage because it's actually kind of scarier than that in some ways. But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, everyone is trying to find how do we describe these things because it doesn't do anything like it used to.
I think it's kind of like what's the expression? Like a bunch of clouds coming together, because the thing is over the last couple of years with NFTs, it's created a commodification of artwork. So you combine the commodification of artwork where artists have never been able to get paid. And now for just this briefest amount of time, they were getting paid. And now people can use this and take their art, an artist's style, and take it for themselves and not pay them anything. So I think that's kind of another reason why this has come to the forefront right now.
You know, that brings up another interesting thing, which is DeviantArt. So when NFTs came out, DeviantArt made a tool that basically could show if your work that is on DeviantArt have been used in an NFT. So you could double check to see if someone is trying to sell your work. This week or last week, DeviantArt came out and said, we are going to also make an AI model. And by default, everyone's art on DeviantArt is included in the model data set. You have to opt out. And DeviantArt artists said, what the fuck? Like, the default should be I opt in, not opt out. Mm-hmm. And so 6 months ago, people would have been like, DeviantArt gets us, they really understand us, and they're protecting us. Mm-hmm. And this week, it's like, well, holy shit, like they're throwing us under the bus. So again, even for these brands like Shutterstock or DeviantArt, like they have to really think about these things and be like, what's right for our community versus what's right for us, because we also will kind of want to get in on these deals, right? So like, you know, I think this is a big, it's definitely a corporate legal question of like, what can we do in terms of service wise, but also it is like what's right for the community, and are we going to see a big backlash if we do the wrong thing here? I would say 9 times out of 10 with some of these traditional artist communities, doing anything with AI is going to see some backlash, again, because I think people don't really understand how the tool works. But 2, especially if you're going to auto opt people in, like that's really going to be a bad look. But at the same time, if you make everyone opt in, you won't get nearly as much data and you won't build your own models, right? So there's this like quandary there. So this is also that Haven't Been Trained On is from a group called Spawning, which is Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst, who are two pretty well-known musicians. The idea there is also if you see your work in that model, you can say, I would like to be opted out in the future. And hopefully maybe in the future, there's some consortium that is actually managing these and saying, hey, this data set is illegal because they're pulling from artists that haven't opted in, but this one is okay because it's pulling in from data sets where that have used the opt-in process. I think the challenge is, as we've noticed, is you need millions upon millions of images for these tools to work as well as they do. So if you ask everyone to opt in, you are never going to get to that level of image data unless you're like paying Getty or DeviantArt or whatever. So it's a challenge, because in order for these models to work, you need a lot of images. And that's why a lot of these companies default to just, we're going to scrape and we'll apologize later, or we'll figure it out later. Which right now it puts us in a situation we're in where people feel like they've been conned or they've been stolen from, rather than saying like, I was actually part of this process.
Right. And the other issue is that if it's not a company in the US, it'll be a company in another country who doesn't have the same laws. So somebody else is just going to do it anyway, and maybe you'll get nothing out of it, as opposed to maybe some kind of royalty or whatever it is, or attribution or something like that. So
yeah, it's probably actually that Americans have probably some of the looser laws, whereas like the EU has really strong GDPR rules, right? Like, you know, the EU would probably get sued over doing a lot of this work because you would be stealing people's work. The other thing, I read an article recently that like a lot of these data sets are funneled through nonprofits. So the team that actually made the OpenAI data set hired a research lab, which is a nonprofit, to build the data set. So they're also kind of like legally finding loopholes to like, you know, reduce their risk exposure and getting it to, and having other people. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, I guess thinking about that too, like this, so there's like the system level things that to be aware of, and then there's like what to do as an individual. And I think even just like treating whether you're using like diffusion or DALL-E or whatever as like part of the artwork, as like part of the materials and part of the context, is like a small thing that an artist can do to acknowledge like, I'm using this very specific technology that comes with all of these like associations and issues, and just kind of like talking about that as part of the work. Yeah, seems like one thing to do versus treating it as just like this magical thing that appeared out of nowhere. And that's sort of how I think about being transparent about prompts, as well, as you mentioned, although I feel a little less strongly about that now, because and actually I guess that's something I'm curious to hear from you about, because I can also see the cases for not including the prompts in some cases. Like that feels like a valid artistic choice, assuming it's not a person who's just like, you know, treating their prompts as like a thing that they individually want to like profit from for like an NFT business or whatever. But yeah, I think at least talking about the models as like part of the materials and part of how it was made feels right to me.
Yeah, there's an argument to be made that we should all go back to VQGAN because VQGAN did such a poor job of actually generating the prompts we gave it that it was kind of an art in and of itself, right? It generated these very like blobby, like sort of more like collagey kind of look, whereas Stable Diffusion and DALL-E are to the point where it actually does do realism really well, which kind of can be a dangerous point if you're using an artist like Greg Rakowski. So yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating and multifaceted sort of problem. And I think to your point, it's right. There's system level stuff and then there's individual level stuff. And you can only control so much on each of those sides, but you do have some decisions to be made there. Yeah.
What if within the tool, every time you used an artist name, it like a little pop-up would come out and say, oh, if you like this image and want to download it, consider giving a tip to this artist or something like that. I mean, that's an opt-in type of thing, but that might help placate some people, at least, especially given the numbers of people that are doing this for particular artists. Yeah. I don't know.
I think it's also worth noting, I mean, I think a lot of people assume that everyone using these tools is trying to become an artist, when a lot of people are just trying to have fun and like make funny memes or funny jokes with these tools, you know? And I think like that's the other challenge is we need to be a little bit more realistic about, you know, just like what are people using these for? Because I think, you know, every time a new tool comes out that like makes something more efficient or changes things, people sort of have this, holy shit, this changes everything. And like, I'd say a lot of times, like, it's not realistic that like that actually does it, right? Like I've seen so many people recently talking about how this is going to change the film industry. And it's like, I don't think most filmmakers are looking at this tool and saying, this gives me the level of control I want. They're like, no, I already have a $10 million budget. I can go out and shoot what I want to shoot, right? Like, and I think there's a little bit of just like tech people always assuming that tech solves everything. When the reality is like a painter still wants to paint because they like the act and process of painting. This isn't going to change that for them, right? And I think that's, you know, there's just a lot of weird arguments being made that make a lot of assumptions around various things. And some people just might be like, hey, I never want to see my work in AI art models. Like that's just not who I am. That's not what I do. And I think we need to have a serious conversation about what we can allow for those people to do, to give them some real like, you know, leverage in those systems.
Right, because a lot of the pricing of art goes into scarcity. So all of a sudden it's not scarce anymore. So that's a big issue. But on the flip side, maybe an original Greg Rakowski like painting or something, but maybe the prices have gone through the roof now. I have no idea, but like, you know, maybe not a print, but maybe an actual work would be like, hey, this is the guy that's, you know, colored this whole movement, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
There's always double-edged swords for all these things, you know, good and bad for a lot of this. Cool.
So Kirby Ferguson's Everything is a Remix video series has interesting context for this sort of thing. It talks a lot about copying and remixing and how we feel we love it when other people copy, but not from us, you know? And so it's an interesting thing that I kind of think about as we're using these tools and seeing what they can do. The other thing is we're looking at what the tools can do now, but if I go back a year and see what it did then and what it can do now, it does make me wonder what's next year going to look like. And is this going to, you know, I think we are going to be forced to make some decisions as the technology gets more sophisticated because it is lightning fast in advances. It's incredible.
Yeah, and I'd say to that point, like one, actually, before I move on to that point, would you mind dropping a link to that video series if you have it in the Slack? I think everyone would like to see that. I think I've seen 1 or 2 videos from it, but I would love to see more as well. I think, you know, look, we're looking at it from an artistic purpose. I think lots of other people are looking at it from like a disinformation purpose, right? Today, it's still kind of hard to say like, oh, show me this politician doing this illegal thing. and being able to share that and be like, oh, look, this is actually happening. I have video proof of this. We're maybe a year or two away from actually doing that and having it look so real that it's believable. And I think that is when we're going to have a real question mark around these things. Like I know DALL-E 2 has watermarking on there. They've got a little image code at the bottom of theirs, but you can delete that. You can like crop around that. ImageGen was kind of doing the same thing. I know there are people that are thinking about how to cryptographically embed stuff like that into the image so that another model could take it out and say, yes, this has been artificially produced. But yeah, I mean, we are definitely like hitting a limit where like, we're going to see some things that people are going to have to make decisions around. And I think, you know, if you give these tech companies all of the leeway, they'll go all the way. And I think we're going to need to have governments and other people get involved to actually like legislate these things. And that's going to be an interesting conversation because most of our politicians are very old and have no idea how these things work, right? So they're going to be like, they're going to believe that this is a collage tool and therefore they're all infringing on copyright. And that'll be like the problem with legislation. So I think you're starting to see actually already the folks that made Stable Diffusion have said they will actually slow down their progress on these tools so they can actually work with researchers to understand the best way to approach it. That kind of backfired to a whole bunch of drama around that, but like some of these places are being more selective about how they share their tools. Sometimes I think they're being selective because it's easier for capitalism purposes, and others I think are actually doing it for the right reason. But to the outside world, it may look like one and the same. Cool. Any last thoughts or any questions about this before we wrap up? All right, well, this is a really fun discussion. I'm glad we talked about this. And I think we'll talk about this way more as we get through more of this material. So yeah, really great class today. Again, I'll post the video when it's done, when the recording is finished processing, and look forward to seeing stuff next week. Again, Thursdays, if you want to stop by and ask questions, more than happy to continue this conversation there as well. All right, thanks everybody. I'll see everyone next week.